This is the third part of lesson 5.3, solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. So I'm just going to go through and do some practice problems that are on the notes, and you're welcome to skip past any that you don't have any problem with, but you need to make sure you understand that there's going to be imaginary solutions, irrational solutions, fraction solutions, and you have to know how to write the answer correctly. So that's why you want to make sure you've got all of these correct. So I'll go through quickly, but again, if you feel like you can skip it, then that's fine. Okay, it says, in the first part, it says, find the discriminant and tell me the number and type of solutions. I'm not asking you to solve this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have to get everything together on the same side because, like I said, it doesn't matter if you don't have everything on the same side. And then I'm going to do the b squared minus 4 times a times c. And so it's going to be 64 minus 0, so that's positive. And so there's going to be two real solutions. Number 2, I'm going to get the 4 on the other side, so I'm going to have 3v squared minus 9v and then 11 minus 4, so plus 7. So I'm going to have b squared minus 4 times a times c. So I'm going to have 81 minus, and then 12 times 7 is 84. And so that's going to give me negative 3, so that's going to be two imaginary or 0 real solutions. Okay, so that's how you use the discriminant to tell you. Now, why is that useful? Well, it becomes useful later if I'm trying to graph or something. If I know that I have imaginary solutions, that tells me something about the graph. So that's useful to know. Solving using the quadratic formula. So again, make sure you've got 0. You're going to do your a, b, and c, so set it up. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared. You don't have to write the negative 6 squared if you want. Like, you know, that wasn't even b. Sorry, that wasn't even right. You don't have to write 12 squared. You know it's 144, so you're welcome to just write that down. And then minus 4 times a times c. You should write that down because there's a little more complication to that. And so you're going to put it in your calculator probably anyway, but you can go ahead and write that down. So negative 12 plus or minus, then you're going to have 144. I like to do this part before I don't type that whole discriminant in my calculator because I kind of miss recognizing like what kind of number it is. So I notice that I'm going to have a negative times a negative, which is positive. So I know I'm going to be adding. So I'm going to have two real solutions here. And so I like to know that. Maybe it's just because I know what's coming up ahead of time. But that's going to be 1152 and then over negative 12. So it's going to be negative 12 plus or minus, and then 144 plus 1152 is 1296. So the square root of 1296. Obviously, I'm going to ask my calculator about that. And so, having trouble here. 36. So negative 12 plus or minus 36 over negative 12. So again, we come to the whole simplifying fractions. You cannot just do that. That does not work. So what you have to do is you're going to think about this as negative 12 over negative 12 plus or minus 36 over negative 12. So that's 1 plus or minus negative 3. 1 plus negative 3, 1 minus negative 3. So you have to think about this as two different solutions and know that you can simplify that. Do not leave it like that. So my solutions, is this x? No, it's v. So I'm going to say v is equal to negative 2 and positive 4. Now, of course, you can check this. If you're on a quiz or a test, I would recommend you check that for sure. And even on your homework, it doesn't hurt to check periodically and making sure you're doing this the right way. So I'm going to work through number 4. And so if you want to work through number 4 and then just come back and make sure you've got the right answer. Okay, I've got the steps written down here. So pause if you need to go back and make sure that you're on the right track. So what I have at the end, I have 11 plus or minus 17 over 12. And so that's 11 plus 17 over 12 and 11 minus 17 over 12. So that's going to be 28 over 12 and negative 6 over 12. So when I write my solutions, checking my letter here, n equals 28 over 12. 4 goes into both of those, so 7/3. And then I'm going to have negative 6 over 12 is negative 1/2. So those are my two solutions. You need to make sure that your answers are reduced fractions. If they're irrational, like if you came up with something like, 3 plus or minus the square root of 2, then that's fine to leave it like that. On your test, on your quiz, I might ask you, give me the bigger one. and round it to the nearest hundredth. And so in that case, you would say, okay, is 3 plus the square root of 2 bigger, or is 3 minus the square root of 2 bigger? And you would calculate the decimals on that. And so on your test, just to simplify how I'm going to ask that, I might ask this. And so this one is going to be about 4.414, and this one is going to be 3 minus the square root of 2 is going to be approximately 1.585. And so if I ask you for the larger one, you're going to tell me that one. If I ask you for the smaller one, you'll tell me that one. So that's just on your test. If you had an irrational number, that's what I would say. Even if you have real numbers, I might ask for just the bigger one or just the smaller one. So just to simplify matters there. Okay, number 5. Go ahead and pause again, and you can just check and make sure that you're getting the right answer. Okay, I worked out the first few. Let me just point out a couple of places where people make common mistakes. One place, of course, making sure that that's 0 is a common mistake. But another place I see it often is when you have negative b and b is already negative. You got to make sure you do negative and then whatever b is. And so that might turn that positive. And then another place I see mistakes is with the signs in that part of the discriminant. And that comes from not writing it out. So I want you to write out that 4 times A times C. I want you to write that because I don't want you to make those mistakes with the negatives. If you miss one negative sign, that's going to mess everything up. And so you can't afford to make those mistakes. Also, don't forget that one, and don't forget to multiply by 2. And so those are all places that I see mistakes. They almost all have to do with negative signs. So be really careful about that. When you come down to the step that I have in green here with 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 215, we need to figure out what is 215. So I know that 5 goes into 215. It's 5 times 43. 43 is prime, so there's nothing I can do with the 215. So that's going to stay under the radical. However, the negative comes out as I, because I squared. So this is what I have there, and I do have the 24 being negative. Now, the way that we usually write that is I shouldn't say usually, but often, we would put the negative up here and then swap those two signs, but since the signs don't matter if they're swapped, usually we just write it like this. Whoops, don't forget the I. Okay, so it doesn't really matter which way you want to do that. On my answer key on the notes, I have the first way. Sometimes I'll write it that way. It doesn't matter, but you want to have your negative with the numerator or the denominator, and usually I like to write it with the numerator. But those are my solutions. There's 2 imaginary solutions, so you can use this in your calculator to check it. So if you wanted to check it, you would type in negative 5 plus I square root 215, and then you would divide by 24, but because you want to divide the entire thing by 24, you need to get either that answer first and then divide by 24, or put that in parentheses and divide by 24. So make sure you're not, what you don't want to do in your calculator is you don't want to type it like this, because then that will just do that part divided by 24. So make sure you're paying attention to that. But you can store that in x, and then you would go back to your original equation, and you would type in negative 12x squared minus 5x minus 5, and you should get 0 if that is the correct solution. Okay, number 6, you'll notice this one, it is quadratic, but it doesn't have that middle term. So in this case, b is equal to 0. And so we've got a is equal to negative 8 and c is equal to 14. So you can still use the quadratic formula. So you say negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So you can still do this even if b is 0. A can't be 0 because then you'd have division, but if you think about it, if a is 0, then it would be something like, you don't need a quadratic formula for that. Okay, so I'm going to have negative 0, which is just 0, so I don't even need to write anything. I'm going to have 4 times 8 times 14, so 32 times 14 is 448, and it's positive over negative 16. Now 448, I know that that's not a square number, but I'm suspecting that something's going to go into that. I'm going to try 4. So that's 4 times 112, and 112 divided by 4 is 28. So 4 times 4 times 28, which is 4 times 7. So I can take out a pair of 4s and a pair of 2s. The 7 is going to stay in over negative 16. So I'm going to have plus or minus 8 square root 7 over 16. That's not simplified, because 8 and 16 both have a factor of 8. So I can say plus or minus 1 square root 7 over 2. And those would be my correct solutions, simplified. Okay, so number 7, again, you've got a b equals 0. So b equals 0. So I'm going to have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So I'm going to have plus or minus 0, and then 4 times 1 times 10 is negative 40 over 2. So the 40 is 8 times 5. So I'm going to have plus or minus 8 times 5, and then the negative is going to give me an I out here. So I'm going to have a pair of 2's, I square root 10 over 2. With that, my 2's can cancel because they're factors. I don't have any plus or minus going on in there. So I can cancel the factors. And so what I'm left with is my solutions are I square root 10, positive and negative. So m is equal to that. Let me back up. If b is 0, did you think of some other thing that we could do? We've learned how to solve that before. And so actually, if you recognize it, you can just solve that by subtracting 10 from both sides, taking the square root, and there you go. So even though we've learned the quadratic formula, stop and think about other things you know, because if you know something that would make this a lot easier, then do that. On the previous one too. On the previous one, if you stop and look at that one, I could have subtracted 14 from both sides. This is one option. I could divide everything by negative 8 too, but anyway, I could do that. Divide everything by negative 8. So I'd have m squared is equal to positive and then 7 over 4. And then take the square root of both sides, so I'd have m is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7 over 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. And that's the same thing that I just had. So, you know, it's all the same. And if you recognize that there's a faster way to do it than the quadratic formula, then don't do the quadratic formula. If you're missing b, if b is 0, quadratic formula is maybe not the way to go. So on this one, I don't want to do that. Now, I cannot take the square root of that side because then I've got I, and I'm trying to solve for a, and then I'd be dividing by I. So, I mean, I guess you could, but you'd have I, a, but because you had something else besides the a in there, you got to do plus or minus, and plus or minus that, and then you've got to divide by I, and then you've got the whole conjugate, and you can't have your imaginaries in your denominator. So we don't want to mess with that. So first thing we're going to do is divide by negative 1. Then that will take care of that. So I've got a squared equals negative 9. Then take the square root, and you've got a is equal to plus or minus 3i. And so you don't want to use your quadratic equation if there's a better way to do it. If you recognize that it's factorable, then factor it. Factor is really fast and easy if you know that it's factorable. You use the quadratic formula when the numbers don't lend itself to factoring, when you don't know if it's factorable and you don't want to waste time messing with it. If you have some reason to think that there's going to be imaginary solutions or irrational solutions, quadratic formula. Okay, last one, the science teacher fires a rocket vertically into the air. So think about what's happening. We're going to go up, and then, of course, it's going to come down. Okay, now it says an initial velocity of 192 feet per second. We're on Earth, and so remember I told you last time that negative 16 is coming from gravity. It's gravity divided by 2. This 192, that's the velocity. So why do you think I don't have anything added on to the end? Where does the rocket start? It's launching from the ground, which is at ground 0. So that's why it's got a plus 0. So question, how long does it take for it to return to the ground? So how many seconds? Okay, so t, h of t means the height at a certain amount of time, so time in seconds. And so that's why we use functions, because we're going to have the height at any particular given time is equal to negative 16t squared plus 192t, and then plus 0 if you care about that. Now I want to know when is that going to return to the ground. So what I want to do is set that equal to 0, and this is what I'm going to solve. So when you have something like this, you can use the quadratic formula. However, I'm going to tell you that when you have something set up like that, it's probably just as easy to factor out the negative 16t. Watch your signs there. And then the 192 divided by 16, that one comes out evenly. It's not always going to come out evenly, but it doesn't really matter because then you just set everything equal to 0. So negative 16t equals 0, or t minus 12 equals 0, which means that time has to equal 0 or time has to equal 12 seconds. Which makes sense because if you think about it, at 0 seconds it was on the ground, and it will take 12 seconds to return to the ground. So the question is, how long does it take for the rocket to return to the ground? So the only answer that I'm going to give here is the 12 seconds because the 0 is not answering that question. 0 is a solution to the equation, but I'm asking a question about how long it takes. So it's going to be on the ground at 0 seconds or 12 seconds, but 12 seconds is when it returns to the ground. Okay, you should now be able to complete your assignment with quadratic formula. Make sure you're very careful and you write things out.